Picture this. It's the year 218. You're in Rome. You've seen some weird things in your life. Gladiators ripping lions apart, senators plotting murders over wine, maybe even a dinner party where the main course was a roasted flamingo stuffed with live dormice. But you've never seen anything like this? Down the avenue comes the golden chariot. Behind it, drums, dancers smoke incense like a parade exploded in a perfume shop. And at the center of it all, a 14-year-old boy in silk robes, eyes rimmed in coal lips, redder than a Vestal Virgin's blush, wearing more jewelry than the Empress herself. He's not just a new emperor. He's a priest, a god's lover. And soon the entire city is about to kneel to his god or else. His name was Elagabalus. A teenager from Syria who didn't just sit on the Roman throne, he hijacked it, rewrote the rituals, and made the greatest empire in the world dance to the beat of his private drum. Now you're probably thinking, how the hell did that happen? What kind of political hurricane lets a gender-bending, God-worshipping, eyeliner-wearing teenager seize control of Rome? Well, let me tell you something about Roman politics. It wasn't always about strategy or military brilliance. Sometimes it was about family. And this kid, he had one hell of a grandmother. Her name was Julia Maesa, widow, power broker, mastermind. She didn't carry a sword. She didn't need to. Her weapon was money rumor and an army of loyal Eastern legions who believed in prophecy and in blood. When her nephew Emperor Caracalla was murdered and a boring bureaucrat named Macrinus stole the throne, Julia knew what to do. She spun a lie so big, so dramatic that it became truth that her grandson, this boy Elagabalus, was actually Caracalla's secret son. It didn't matter if it was real. It was Roman politics. Perception was reality, and reality was about to get flamboyant. So when soldiers in Syria started chanting Elagabalus's name and hoisting him on their shields, it wasn't just a coup. It was the beginning of one of the most outrageous reigns in human history. Next up, we'll meet the women who pulled the strings. The lies that built a god, and the very first time Rome looked at an emperor and collectively said, "Wait, what is he wearing?" Let's get one thing straight. Elagabalus didn't climb to power on the backs of soldiers or by outwitting senators in marble halls. He didn't lead an army or give fiery speeches in the forum. No, this was not your usual Roman rise to glory. This was a palace play written, directed, and produced by women. And not just any women, Syria's sharpest minds wrapped in silk and scandal. At the center, Julia Maesa, grandmother to Elagabalus, sister-in-law to Septimius Severus, the African-born emperor who'd clawed his way into Roman history with brute force and battlefield brilliance. Maesa had lived through empire-making. She understood power. She could smell it. And when she lost it after her nephew Caracalla's death, she wanted it back. Badly. But Rome had changed. The man who took the throne after Caracalla Macrinus wasn't even from the Severan bloodline. He was a paper pusher turned Praetorian prefect who got lucky with a dagger. To the Roman elites, he was a placeholder. To Julia Maesa, he was an insult. So what did she do? She weaponized a story. The kind of story Rome couldn't resist. She claimed her teenage grandson Elagabalus, a boy priest from Emesa who worshipped a black meteorite, was actually Caracalla's bastard son, the child of a secret royal affair, a rightful heir, divine blood in silk robes. And you know what? It worked. But Julia didn't stop there. She and her daughter Julia Soemias, the boy's mother, knew they needed more than a myth. They needed muscle. So they bribed the Eastern legions, gold promotions promises. They told every Syrian soldier who'd ever marched under Caracalla that the emperor lived on in this wide-eyed, soft-voiced teenager who just so happened to resemble him in the right lighting. In May of 218, they made their move. At the military camp near Emesa, Elagabalus appeared before the troops draped in imperial purple, claiming to be Caracalla's son. He didn't shout commands. He didn't swing a sword. He stood there, radiant, strange, and unstoppable. The legionaries erupted. They proclaimed him emperor on the spot. Word spread like wildfire. From Syria to Cappadocia to Egypt, garrisons flipped loyalty like it was a game of dice. Macrinus, blindsided, tried to suppress the uprising, but it was too late. His own men were whispering betrayal. By the time the two armies clashed at the Battle of Antioch that June, Macrinus's fate was sealed. He fled. He was caught. He was beheaded. Just like that. And so, with barely a drop of royal blood and not a single real political credential, a 14-year-old boy walked over the corpse of an emperor and claimed the world's greatest throne. But make no mistake, this wasn't his victory. It was Julia Maesa's. She had resurrected her family's dynasty using a boy, a god, and a lie. Rome had no idea what was coming. They expected a puppet. What they got was a wildfire in priests' robes. And the question now wasn't whether Elagabalus could rule, it was whether anyone could control him. Spoiler, they couldn't. Next, we follow Elagabalus as he journeys west. And trust me, Rome has no idea that the emperor heading their way comes not with laurels and scrolls, but with dancers' incense and a sacred rock from the heavens. It took more than a year for Elagabalus to reach Rome. A year filled with ceremonies, parades, feasts, and the kind of theatrics that would have made even Caligula roll his eyes. But when he finally arrived in 219, the Eternal City didn't get an emperor. It got a revelation. And not everyone was thrilled. Rome had seen emperors before war heroes, tyrants, philosophers, and maniacs. But none like this. Elagabalus didn't ride into town in armor. He arrived in silk, flanked by dancers, priests, eunuchs, and musicians pounding out rhythms nobody in the West had ever heard before. His entrance wasn't a triumph. It was a transformation. And at the center of it all, a black stone. Not a symbol, not a statue, a literal meteorite. The sacred object of the god Elagabal dragged from Syria to Rome, placed on a golden chariot, and rolled into the capital like a new Caesar. To Elagabalus, this wasn't just ceremony. This was Rome now. He declared Elagabal the supreme deity above Jupiter, above Mars, above every god that had defined Roman identity for centuries. Every morning, the emperor performed rituals in flowing robes and a jeweled crown dancing before the sacred stone. Roman priests watched in stunned silence as their new emperor turned the Palatine Hill into a Syrian temple complex. To the Roman elite, this wasn't religion. It was heresy and drag, and it didn't stop there. Elagabalus wasn't interested in adding his god to the Roman pantheon. He wanted a full-on takeover. Temples were rededicated, festivals rewritten. Jupiter, the king of gods, was ordered to submit to Elagabal. Statues of Roman gods were brought to his temple and symbolically married to the black stone. You could hear the collective gasp from the Senate floor to the bakeries of Trastevere, and yet it was only the beginning, because religion wasn't the only thing Elagabalus planned to rewrite. He had something even more provocative in mind: Rome's understanding of gender. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became scandal. The emperor wore makeup, yes, but he also wore dresses. He walked the palace halls calling himself a bride. One day he appeared in public wearing women's shoes. The next he asked to be called not imperator, but empress. He didn't just break norms, he shattered them into tiny jeweled fragments. Historians argue over how much of this is fact, how much is propaganda. But what's undeniable is this: Rome was forced to watch its most sacred traditions. Military valor, masculine power, religious orthodoxy become the personal playground of a teenage emperor who worshipped a god no one could understand, spoke with an accent no one could imitate, and carried himself with a confidence no one could control. And the Senate. They sat there, robes, stiff expressions, frozen, clapping when expected, trying to pretend nothing was on fire when in fact everything was. The old world wasn't slipping away. It was being paraded through the forum in a golden headdress, dancing to a foreign drumbeat and asking to be called Your Majesty's wife. In the next chapter, we enter the heart of madness, a palace turned temple, a state turned stage, and an emperor who made gender power and faith bend to his will until the empire bent back. Once Elagabalus was settled in the imperial palace, the real performance began. Not governing, not legislating, not war councils or senatorial debates. No, this wasn't the business of empire anymore. This was theater. And the emperor. He wasn't your usual grim-faced bureaucrat. He was the headliner in a never-ending gold-drenched, incense-soaked spectacle. Every morning the court awoke not to decrees but to drums. Priests filed in, musicians tuned up. The emperor entered in glittering robes, sometimes in feminine dress, sometimes in nothing but veils and chains, wearing more makeup than a Roman bride on her wedding day. And the sacred black stone. It stood in its temple like a cosmic VIP, watching it all unfold. Elagabalus treated the imperial court like a sacred circus. He'd summon senators to rituals where they were forced to clap along to Eastern chants they didn't understand, nod to gods they didn't believe in, and watch their emperor dance chant, and sometimes, according to one mortified observer, simulate divine marriage ceremonies with the meteorite. But the palace wasn't just a place of worship. It was a fashion runway, a performance space, a nightclub, and some whispered a brothel. Banquets became orgies of excess. Dishes were served on gold platters seasoned with pearls garnished with hummingbird tongues or powdered amber. The guest list included everyone from senators to charioteers to circus performers. One day, Elagabalus reportedly threw a feast where he sat between two male lovers, feeding them grapes like he was Cleopatra, and they were living statues. Then there was Zodicus, a Greek athlete with biceps like marble and thighs that made statues jealous. Elagabalus married him publicly, taking the role of bride complete with veil dowry and wedding vows. And that wasn't even his only husband. Roman society, already squeamish about same-sex relationships, nearly imploded, watching their emperor not just indulge, but celebrate it with royal fanfare. The emperor even offered rewards to any physician who could surgically transition him into a woman, yes, in the 3rd century. Historians still debate the truth behind this, but whether fact or exaggerated smear, the idea of it shook Rome to its foundations. This wasn't just gender bending. This was imperial blasphemy. To the traditional Roman ruling class, this all looked like a sickness, not just of the body or the mind, but of the empire itself. The military began to grow restless. The Senate sat paralyzed in horror. Priests muttered that Jupiter had turned his back on Rome. But to Elagabalus, everything was going according to plan. He wasn't mismanaging Rome. He was remaking it into a city where the divine wore eyeliner power didn't need masculinity, and the gods could speak in foreign tongues. But there was one problem. You can't keep putting on a show forever, especially when the crowd starts booing. As the imperial treasury drained and frontier wars were ignored, even the emperor's closest allies began to flinch. Julia Maesa, the very woman who had put him on the throne, was now watching her creation spiral. What had started as a power play had turned into a public crisis. And behind the scenes, Rome's oldest tool for regime change was sharpening its blade. Next up, betrayal brews in velvet-draped halls. The empire is exhausted. The generals are whispering. And the emperor, he's too busy trying on wedding dresses to see the sword coming. By 221, the mood in Rome had shifted, and you could feel it in the air. The incense didn't mask the tension anymore. The pageants weren't charming. The music, the feasts, the orgies, it all began to rot from the inside like spoiled fruit in a golden bowl. Even the gods, some whispered, had stopped watching. Elagabalus, still just a teenager, had turned the empire into his own private altar. Every decision, every law, every spectacle served one purpose, glorifying the god Elagabal and the emperor's own vision of the world. That vision. It was dazzling. It was wild. It was completely divorced from reality. He neglected the military. The frontiers burned while the emperor danced. Germanic tribes were testing the Rhine. Trouble stirred in the east. And back in Rome, the once loyal Praetorian Guard, those personal bodyguards of the emperor, began to ask themselves a dangerous question. Is this the guy we're willing to die for? Behind the velvet curtains of the imperial palace, the woman who had once orchestrated Elagabalus's meteoric rise now sat in quiet calculation. Julia Maesa. She had built this empire. She could unbuild it too. She saw what Elagabalus couldn't. The boy was losing the army, losing the Senate, losing the people. Rome didn't just need a god, it needed a general, or at least someone who looked the part. Enter Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's cousin, younger, sober, clean-shaven. He didn't wear eyeliner. He didn't dance. He didn't make sacrifices to meteorites or marry gladiators. To the soldiers and senators desperate for normalcy, He was boring in all the right ways. So Julia Maesa made a plan. Quietly, she began building support around Alexander. She told the guard he was the future, promised them pay, promised them stability, and promised above all that this would be a transition, not a coup. Elagabalus would step aside gracefully. Alexander would rule in name, but the family would remain in control. Only one problem. Elagabalus didn't get the memo. He felt the shift in power, the change in whispers, the cold stares, and he panicked. Hard. He stripped titles from Alexander, tried to exile him, then changed his mind and offered to share power. It was too late. The soldiers had chosen their side. The emperor's grip on power was slipping, and like a drowning man he clutched at rituals, sacrifices, and superstition. He increased the frequency of religious ceremonies, added more offerings, more silk, more dancers. He believed, or at least hoped, that if he pleased the gods enough, the people would follow. But the gods weren't listening. Neither were the soldiers, and certainly not the Senate. In the final days, paranoia gripped the palace like a storm. Elagabalus grew erratic. He accused priests of betrayal, ordered executions for imagined plots. One day he demanded that all portraits of Alexander be removed from public view. The next he begged his cousin to stay by his side. It was a slow-motion collapse, the kind where everyone sees the wreck coming except the one steering the ship. Then came the final act. March 11th, 222 AD. Elagabalus arrived at the Praetorian camp with his mother. It was supposed to be a simple address, a show of unity, a reminder that he still ruled. Instead, he walked straight into the jaws of betrayal. The guards, already aligned with Alexander, turned on him. Eyewitness accounts say he tried to command them. They laughed. He tried to flee. They blocked every exit. And just like that, the emperor of Rome, the high priest of the sun god, the boy who had once made the empire kneel, was dragged into the dirt and slaughtered. His mother, Julia Soaemius, met the same fate. There were no last words, no funeral, no shrine. Their bodies were stripped, mutilated, paraded through the streets like trophies of shame, and finally thrown into the Tiber River like garbage. For Rome, this was the ultimate insult, a way to scrub not just a person, but an entire ideology off the map. But some things can't be erased. You can burn portraits, break statues, drown bodies. But the story always floats back to the surface. Next, we'll dive into the aftermath. The cleanup, the cover-up, and the long, strange legacy of the boy emperor who turned Rome into his personal temple and paid for it with his life. The body of Elagabalus didn't just disappear into the Tiber. It sent ripples through history that no river could wash away. In the days following his assassination, Rome began the ancient ritual of political erasure. It had a name, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. And for Elagabalus, it was carried out with surgical precision. His images were destroyed, statues toppled, coins melted down, inscriptions chiseled clean. The black stone of Elagabal, dragged all the way from Syria to dominate the Palatine Hill, was quietly packed up and shipped back to Emesa like a piece of bad luggage. The temples he'd built were rededicated to Jupiter and Mars. The court rituals he'd enforced gone. His exotic costumes burned. His Syrian priests expelled. Rome scrubbed every trace of the boy emperor from its walls, its records, and its soul. Or so they thought. Because erasing Elagabalus wasn't so simple. You can destroy statues. You can exile gods. But stories. Stories have a nasty habit of surviving. And the stranger the story, the stronger the grip it holds on the human imagination. Ancient historians, especially Cassius Dio and the ever-gossipy authors of the Historia Augusta, couldn't resist the tale. They painted Elagabalus as a monster, a freak, a moral disaster dressed in pearls and perfume. They called him the most effeminate of emperors, a beast, a disgrace to Rome. But let's pause here, because centuries later, historians are rethinking the narrative. What if what we've inherited isn't a biography but a smear campaign? What if Elagabalus was less a monster and more a radical who scared the hell out of traditional Rome? Modern scholars have asked the questions Rome never dared voice. Was Elagabalus Rome's first transgender ruler? Was his obsession with ritual and transformation rooted in Syrian religious tradition, not madness? Were his marriages to men and his rejection of masculine military ideals simply too much for Rome's rigid hierarchy to tolerate? We don't know, and maybe we never will. But here's what we can say. Elagabalus exposed Rome's fault lines: East versus West, tradition versus change, empire versus identity. His reign was a cosmic experiment performed live on the world's biggest stage and shut down mid-act when the audience revolted. He didn't just try to rule Rome, he tried to remake it, not with armies or taxes or roads, but with ritual performance and self-expression. He asked, what if the emperor was the high priest of a god you'd never heard of? What if the ruler wore silk, not steel? What if Rome bowed not to Mars, but to the sun? Rome answered absolutely not. And yet, the story of Elagabalus remains. Maybe because it's too bizarre to forget. Or maybe, just maybe, because it speaks to something deeper, something we still wrestle with now. What happens when someone dares to be radically different in a world that demands sameness? What does it cost to challenge the rules of gender, faith, and power all at once? And what kind of courage or madness does it take to crown yourself in lipstick and call it divine? Elagabalus died at 18, but his ghost, it never quite left the stage. In the final chapter, we'll step back and ask, was he a tragic child, a dangerous heretic, or an icon born too early? And what can this most misunderstood emperor teach us about the world we live in now? Centuries have passed since Elagabalus was dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber. The empire that killed him collapsed long ago. His temples are ruins. His coins, those that escape the melting pot, sit behind museum glass, more curiosity than currency. But somehow this strange, dazzling, and doomed teenager refuses to vanish. He lingers not as a hero, not exactly as a villain, but as a question. A flickering reflection in the mirror of history asking, what do we do with those who don't fit? In the Renaissance, artists rediscovered Elagabalus and couldn't look away. He became the embodiment of decadence. Paintings showed him drowning banquet guests in rose petals, riding through Rome in a chariot drawn by naked women, or presiding over orgies dressed in embroidered gold. Was any of it true? Probably not. But the image stuck. In the 19th and 20th centuries, writers, poets, and philosophers resurrected him again, some with fascination, others with disgust. To the Victorians, he was the ultimate warning: give into passion, to sensuality, to difference, and you end like him. But to others, especially those exploring gender sexuality and the politics of identity, he became something else: a pioneer, a martyr, a transgressor who refused to live by someone else's script, because that's the real power of Elagabalus. Whether you see him as Rome's most twisted tyrant or its most misunderstood teenager, his reign forces us to reckon with the boundaries of identity. It makes us ask what happens when the private becomes public, when belief becomes law, when a child is handed absolute power and decides to turn an empire into a mirror of their soul. And let's not pretend these questions belong only to ancient history. They're as modern as ever. The tension between tradition and change, between gender norms and self-expression, between the state and the individual that didn't die with Rome. It's right here, in the headlines, in the courts, in every debate about who gets to define what's sacred, what's natural, and what kind of person is allowed to rule, to lead, or simply to exist. That's why Elagabalus matters, not because he was good, not because he was evil, but because he pushed the boundaries until they snapped and forced a civilization to reveal what it was really afraid of. Not swords, not gods, but difference. In the end, Elagabalus didn't just fall because he married a man or wore a dress. He fell because he dared to make the empire see him. He put the spotlight on himself and asked Rome to look. And Rome, proud, paranoid Rome, blinked. So the next time you walk past a monument or read a headline about someone being too much, too strange, too bold, remember the boy in silk who once held the world in his painted hands, the boy who ruled for 4 years, who reigned like a god, who died like a scandal, but whose story centuries later still refuses to die. And maybe that's the real legacy of Elagabalus. Not power, not empire, but memory. The kind that haunts, the kind that glitters, the kind that whispers you can kill the person but you can't bury the question they leave behind. Sweet dreams. You'd think that after being erased, vilified, drowned, and dragged, Elagabalus would fade into the static of forgotten emperors. Another footnote in Rome's long parade of madness and ambition. But here's the twist: his story won't sit still. It keeps resurfacing, shape-shifting with every new generation that finds something in it worth arguing over. Because Elagabalus isn't just history. He's debated history. Disputed, distorted, dissected. No emperor has been more rewritten, not because we don't have enough sources, but because those sources can't seem to agree on what he was. Take Cassius Dio, senator, historian, old-school conservative. To him, Elagabalus wasn't just a bad emperor. He was an affront to everything Roman. A gender-bending, god-swapping insult who needed to be wiped from memory for the good of the state. Then you have the Historia Augusta, written later, full of scandal gossip and straight-up fan fiction. This source gleefully details Elagabalus's lovers, rituals, costumes, and parties, painting a portrait so over-the-top it borders on satire. If you believe everything they say, Elagabalus makes Nero look like a church deacon. But here's the real question. How much of that was true? And more importantly, how much was agenda? Because once you understand how Roman elites used history as propaganda, Elagabalus starts to look less like a disaster and more like a target. A scapegoat. Someone who broke so many of their rules, gender, class, religion, power, that the only way to deal with him was to destroy not just his body, but his story. But again, he refused. Fast forward to today, and Elagabalus is being rediscovered not just as a curiosity, but as a symbol, a conversation, a provocation. Some scholars frame him as an early example of gender nonconformity, possibly even transgender. They point to the ancient reports of him requesting surgery, his preference for feminine titles, his marriages to men. Was Elagabalus really perverted? Or was he simply expressing a gender identity 2 millennia ahead of its time? Others caution against reading modern labels into ancient lives. They argue that Syrian religious rituals included gender-fluid roles for priests, that what Romans saw as deviance may have been deeply sacred in the East. Maybe Elagabalus wasn't rejecting order, he was living out a different order entirely. One that terrified Rome because it didn't center them. And yet even those trying to defend Elagabalus sometimes get trapped in the spectacle. He becomes a symbol for whatever argument is being made. Progressive hero or cautionary tale stripped of his context, turned into metaphor. But let's not forget he was also a kid. 14 when he took the throne. 18 when he was murdered. Raised in a temple, flung into an empire, manipulated by his family, adored by his cult, and hated by a senate that had never seen anything like him. He was adored, he was feared, he was used, and maybe, just maybe, he never had a chance. So where does that leave us? With a complicated, chaotic legacy. One that challenges our neat categories and asks more questions than it answers. What is power without conformity? What is faith without compromise? What happens when someone dares to live publicly in ways the world doesn't have language for yet? Elagabalus didn't survive Rome, but his story did. And that story is still evolving. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about how we remember it, who tells it, what we choose to highlight and what we bury. And in the case of Elagabalus, the fact that we're still telling his story, arguing over it, reclaiming it, reframing it, means he never really left. He's not just a ghost in Rome, he's a mirror. And what you see in that mirror depends on where you're standing and what you're afraid to look at. In our final segment, we'll step out of the ruins and into the present, exploring how this long-dead emperor lives on in modern culture and why his legend keeps haunting the edge of empire, identity, and memory. You can bury a body, erase a name, even melt down every coin, but some stories are just too strange, too provocative, too alive to stay dead. Elagabalus is one of them. Over 800 years after his fall, the boy emperor is still making headlines not in the Roman Forum, but in art galleries, academic debates, queer history anthologies, and yes, even YouTube thumbnails. His name sparks debate, fascination, revulsion, and admiration, often all at once. And that tells you something: we're still not sure what to do with him. In the 19th century, artists couldn't resist his flair for the dramatic. Painters like Lawrence Alma Tadema and Jean-Léon Gérôme captured his story in oil, glorifying, condemning, or simply gawking at the chaos. One of the most famous depictions, The Roses of Elagabalus by Lawrence. It shows the emperor reclining above a banquet, casually watching as his guests are suffocated beneath an avalanche of rose petals. Pure theater, probably apocryphal, but unforgettable. By the early 20th century, Elagabalus took on a different meaning. Writers like Antonin Artaud and Joris Karl Huysmans saw in him a kind of anarchic purity, someone who destroyed not out of evil, but out of divine chaos. To the decadents, he wasn't a cautionary tale. He was a lifestyle. Fast forward to the 21st century, and his legacy gets even more layered. In queer communities and trans history, Elagabalus has become a lightning rod. Some see in him the earliest recorded figure to defy rigid gender norms on a public, even imperial stage. Others warn against applying modern identities to ancient contexts too neatly. But either way, his reign forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Identity and power have always collided, and when they do, the results can be beautiful, terrifying, or both. In pop culture, Elagabalus makes cameo appearances everywhere, from novels and operas to heavy metal songs and video games. He's been imagined as a flamboyant tyrant, a misunderstood prophet, a trans icon, a lunatic messiah. Everyone wants a piece of him. No one can quite pin him down, and maybe that's the point. Elagabalus doesn't fit into neat categories. He resists them. He exploded the Roman mold of masculinity, defied the political expectations of the empire, and turned religion into performance art. He was emperor, priest, diva, teenager. And whether you see him as a trailblazer or a disaster or something in between, he reminds us that identity, when wielded publicly, becomes power, and power, when wielded without permission, becomes a threat. Rome responded to that threat with knives. But we write, paint, argue, and remember. Because history isn't just what happened, it's how we choose to interpret it. And in that sense, Elagabalus still reigns. He rules over the uncomfortable conversation, the tension between tradition and transformation, between what society says is sacred and what one person dares to make sacred for themselves. So maybe we never really buried him. Maybe he lives in every debate about who gets to lead love worship or even exist outside the lines. And maybe, just maybe, he's still out there somewhere in the smoke and gold of history's back room, grinning behind his jeweled veil, asking the same question he asked Rome. Are you ready for something different? Because if not, too late. In the final part, we'll close the curtain exploring what Elagabalus ultimately left behind, not in marble or monument, but in the story itself. A story that refuses to behave. A story that, like its subject, always comes back dressed in something new. So here we are at the end of the story, or what seems like the end. Elagabalus is dead. His name was carved off monuments. His god was packed in a crate and shipped back to Syria. His family replaced him with a safer, quieter cousin who worshipped Jupiter, respected the Senate, and wore pants. But if history teaches us anything, it's that stories don't end where people do. They evolve. They echo. And in the case of Elagabalus, they disrupt. Because Rome didn't just kill a boy emperor, they tried to kill an idea. The idea that power doesn't always look how you expect it to. That gender, faith, and leadership don't need to come pre-packaged in togas and military medals. That someone could stand on the most powerful throne in the world and use it not to fight wars, but to question who gets to define reality itself. And that idea still scares people. Every generation reinterprets Elagabalus. Some call him dangerous. Others call him divine, but no one ignores him, because you can't. He challenges too much. He forces a conversation about everything empires try to control: gender, sexuality, religion, power, tradition. He's a spark in the archives, a ghost in the marble. He's been buried 1,000 times, and he always digs his way back up. Maybe it's because he asks something we're still not ready to answer. What happens when someone refuses to play by the rules of the world they inherit? Elagabalus didn't want to restore Rome. He wanted to reimagine it. He took a civilization built on conquest and control and tried to turn it into a temple, his temple. And when the empire refused to kneel, he paid the price. But that doesn't make him a failure. It makes him a reminder that every empire, no matter how powerful, is built on shared assumptions, on rituals, on myths. And when someone comes along and dares to perform a different myth, they either become legend or lesson. Elagabalus became both. He's a legend draped in silk, dancing through the ashes of old gods. And he's a lesson etched into every political system, every institution, every rigid tradition that still fears what it cannot label. So no, the curtain doesn't fall. Because somewhere out there, someone is asking the same questions Elagabalus once posed beneath the Roman sun. Someone is wearing something they're not supposed to wear, praying to something they're not supposed to believe in, loving someone they were told they couldn't, and daring to lead not by conquest, but by being. And in that moment, whether they know it or not, they stand in the legacy of a teenage emperor whose reign lasted just 4 years, but whose shadow stretches across 18 centuries. He was outrageous, he was terrifying, he was unforgettable. He was Elagabalus, and he never really left. Sweet dreams.